technically I am too. Maybe not as officially as you, but because they give me free drinks at least. But if you're actually on the crew, maybe they won't. You can say you're guarding the place.
I'm camping here too, anyhow. So
Okay, well that's
like
cool.
home, so.
And I've even got like a pen and paper stashed here and other resources. So.
Slightly warm in here.
Maybe if they would turn on the heat, it would set. You could sit in those chairs, but I figured this, if a chair is too comfortable, it'll put you to sleep probably.
Oh, touche.
I mean, I don't know. You know your energy best. I mean, for me, I'm at my high energy point of the day. But you should also feel free to interrupt me because I tend to get very loquacious under the influence of weed, and I can go on a monologue and miss letting people get in a word in edgewise and that kind of thing.
Thank you. We rolling?
Yeah.
All right. So earlier, you'd mentioned Ken Wilber and some other folks' alleged ability to fall asleep while maintaining waking awareness.
Right.
I've been able to do that on a few occasions.
Oh, wow.
Mm-hmm. And it's has been by far the most remarkable type of lucidity I've experienced.
Was there a certain technique that led to that, or is it just something that through everything that you've been doing began to happen?
The latter of the two.
Okay.
Yeah.
I like that because I like things that are like a spontaneous, organic outgrowth rather than a labored kind of.
Never had to force it.
Okay.
But I haven't tried to force it either.
Okay.
It's been it's usually during naps. It's more likely to happen during naps, I've noticed.
Right.
And I can feel the transition taking place, which feels almost like a floating or falling.
Okay.
Although, depending on one's definition, this may cross the boundaries of out-of-body experience.
Right.
So, I don't quite have a good measurement of which is which. Nonetheless, I am maintaining a waking awareness during some sort of transition.
Right.
Regardless.
Right.
And they do seem to have some similarities. It starts with the floating or falling sensation.
Okay.
And then it's followed by sound. And the sound is some sort of, it could be a song, it could be conversations. Usually it's conversations, actually. And it feels like, imagine if you were to be walking down a city street, a busy city street, and you're hearing people and you're walking by, the conversations are passing you by.
Right.
And sometimes I'm able to pick up some of those words, too. One time, they were talking about peanuts. And, but nonetheless, I was passing through some sort of space, and it's either music or people chattering. And once I pass through that space, sound, then visuals materialize. So it's always, again, body sensation, followed by sound, followed by visuals.
Wow, that's fascinating.
Yeah. And that's been been that same formula every time that this process takes place in transition.
Wow, it's tempting me to want to make statements about those stages, even though I realize that could be totally faulty, but they're just like speculations. Like with the first stage, it does seem like out-of-body experience, that you're experiencing the transition from your physical body to your dream body. And so the first thing you would feel is a kind of vertigo because the dream body isn't subject to gravity. So you feel this kind of like floating sensation as you are, there's no longer a gravity orientation. And then the second stage is really interesting because one thing it suggests, because I think with naps, I think it's sort of like a compressed version of the sleep cycle. So because things are coming quicker, and you already probably have more, or already have been awake for a few hours, and probably the chemistry of your brain is probably different too, because there's like more wakefulness juice in you or something. And so and then I think maybe you're going through a quick cognitive sleep state. Like now they have this other sleep state that's been recognized that's not REM, but where you're like thinking in your head. And
is there a name for that?
The cognitive sleep state. And so it sounds like a brief cognitive sleep state, but maybe instead of it being your thoughts, maybe you're telepathically picking up like telepathic bandwidths of like the psychic noise that's out there.
It definitely feels like there's a tuning the dial, you know,
like tuning through a radio dial,
exactly.
And like, you know, you get catching pieces
and
of.
these are all these other stations that are
right, like something that would evoke that state for me. I think is. Have you ever seen the Cronenberg film Scanners, a classic film from the 80s?
No, I've not.
Kind of surreal. It's sort of like the ultimate, like if a genius making a grade B science fiction movie, but really bringing out all these amazing archetypes about mutants. And what it starts with is there are these mutants called scanners whose mothers have been given an experimental drug when they were pregnant. And it's made them more telepathic amongst other differences. But most of them are living like totally dysfunctional lives, and the guy we see who becomes the protagonist is like a homeless guy, and he's walking around in a mall like looking for food that people have left on their tables and stuff. And then as we like enter his point of view, we see why he's so dysfunctional, is that like he's constantly overhearing people's thoughts. And often it's like people looking at him and that man looks disgusting, they shouldn't blah 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 blah, and he's like catching fragments, like scanning through a radio dial or police scanner and hearing like all these fragments of people, and it completely disrupts his being able to have a functional consciousness.
You mentioned this this film in Crossing the Event Horizon. Did you mention it at all?
No, I didn't mention Scanners. No.
Okay.
I don't think I did.
I don't know. It just seems like I've heard
possible,
someone speak about it briefly.
But it's got a few of the singularity archetype elements.
Okay.
It would be a great one to evoke that state, I think.
I'll look into it. Thank you. Another thing that comes to mind is each time these sleep, or I guess awake to sleep, lucid transitions take place, I'm not really quite sure what to call it thus far. I don't have like a phrase to call it. I don't know if anybody else has
that's
it. In like
falling
a single
asleep
word.
lucidity or something. Somebody should invent a word for that.
Nonetheless, once the visuals take hold, I never see my room or my body or anything.
Okay.
I should point that out because that's very different.
We probably won't even see your faces except as a silhouette, but this will be in case we make a podcast out of it or something. Capture the scene. But yeah, I mean that's such a privileged state to be in that liminal place, that liminal zone, and liminality is a very big thing for me because I think that is a really magical zones, and I mean everything you're doing for me is about liminality. I mean that's what lucid dreaming is, because you're in a between and betwixt state. And it's maybe the ultimate between and betwixt state, except maybe for a near-death experience when you're between life and death. To be between waking consciousness and dreaming, and to have them together, that's an incredible boundary land where many things are possible.
Absolutely. What comes to mind again, maybe I mentioned it yesterday, is the multi-location sensation of, here is the dream space that I'm experiencing. Here is my sleeping body and all the sensations associated with that.
Right.
And in some cases, here is dream layer B, which is entirely separate from dream layer A.
Right.
And there's these, what I feel like, 3 separate realities that are overlaid but are experienced with great detail, and each can be described individually. They're not so overwhelmingly complex, but it was as if I experienced them individually, but they're happening simultaneously, it seems. And that's probably one of the more strange phenomena that I've experienced out of my years of doing the dream work.
Yeah, I mean, and that sounds like an amazing state. I mean, I wonder if that would be ego dissolving, because usually the ego is based in identifying with like one situation, and now you're aware of yourself as more the self than the ego, and the self can be having like we talked about that jellyfish thing. What was I talking to you?
Yes, you did mention that.
And the jellyfish incarnation idea of the self having tentacles that are like simultaneous lifetimes that are going on.
Mm-hmm.
So you're actually getting to experience that. So you're getting closer to the central self rather than the ego, which would be because the ego would be like related very intensely to your situational awareness within one timeline only.
Mm-hmm.
Like not even the dream time, but just the waking life and the bills and the he said, she said of that particular zone.
Absolutely.
So that's pretty fascinating to, and you probably read in my book, there was this woman who tells me about a dream about Demon Ride, about a virtual reality drug that a friend of hers offers, and there are different variations of it, and in one of the variations you could take because each of these drugs would contain an actual experience. You could take two at once and have overlapping experiences. And the one that she had in the dream was of being in an ancient library with like parchment scrolls and stuff, and skydiving. So it's almost as if I can see her like hanging in the library, but like the air is rushing past her, like she's skydiving. Like both are happening at once, and she's experiencing both of them. And that just seems amazing. I mean, it seems like distracting and distasteful from like a movie point of view.
Right.
But on the other hand, I see it as awakening you to the magic, because you're seeing that it's a violation of like the mono matrix, where usually you're overwhelmed by one trance or another, or by one matrix or another. But as soon as you put two together, then like your loyalty or identification with either one of them is greatly lessened. You're in a liminal state where it's like, I'm between matrices right now.
Right.
Who am I really?
Mm-hmm.
Why not a third or a fourth if I don't like these two?
Well, this brings to mind lucid situations, and I share this in my workshops of suggesting what's possible. And that, let's say if somebody enjoys playing soccer, I suggest to folks, while in a lucid space, try doing something not necessarily fantastic, but something you enjoy, and see what happens. So if you enjoy doing yoga, try doing yoga. If you like playing soccer, try that. If you enjoy singing, try singing. And but there's still boundary dissolving physics that are possible in that state. And so one may meditate, do yoga, or play soccer, or sing with entirely new capacities. So if somebody is playing soccer, why not play the entire team? Why couldn't you not be the entire team, or even two teams playing one another, and you are in control of that situation, and you're aware of all of the players simultaneously, and you are this sort of mega organism taking place.
And actually, I mean, another way to get to that breaking the single identification mode that can be very available for some people, like it works for me, is you create an auto-erotic fantasy and flip back and forth between the two people.
Oh, that's
because conventionally you're identified with one person who's with the hottie of their type or whatever, but what if you can identify with one and then with what the other is feeling, because you're generating both of them.
That maybe has happened before for me. I'd have to review the journals.
And that's because that's a fantasy situation where there's a lot of chi. It's very electrified. There's a lot of energy flowing into it. So it's a great one to practice that.
It's interesting. Another thing, earlier we were talking about multi-location and multiple selves and experiencing lives simultaneously. Another one of my most, I guess, staggering dreams to date was where I experienced the most extreme time dilation yet, where it felt like at first it was a past, present, future dream. So that it started out in the past, and then there were things that happened in the present that triggered the future, and that future spanned multiple lifetimes. And so I experienced multiple lifetimes in this dream, and past, present, and future. And when I came to waking consciousness, I was very, very much in question of my waking life, because it felt like I had just been somewhere else for much longer than the years that I've been here.
And I get distracted for a second, but at the first part of that, like when were these parallel existences? Like, in other words, there were similar situations, but where some choice was different, or are they just like completely different?
They were more linear and sequential.
Okay. But like you would shift from one to the other, but then you wake up remembering the whole sequence of different ones.
Yes.
And like when you switched from one to another, are you like in a different place, or like what has changed? What are the parameters that have changed? Are you still there, but the situation has changed, or are you now, a different identity?
It's complicated because I'll give you a summary. Basically, the two protagonists in the dream, one of which was me. Sometimes I was seeing myself in third person. Sometimes I was in the body. We stopped time after somehow understanding some leading edge esoteric science in regards to human DNA. And we were able to stop time, and then what I would describe as the time police showed up. And they were very upset that we'd stopped time, because we were able to move outside of time. Basically, everything else and everyone else froze, but we were able to continue, and everybody was going super slow motion, basically.
Right.
And these other folks showed up who also had this ability. They were almost like the
guild of time shifters.
The guild of time shifters, the archons of the time matrix showed up and said,
right, the immune system of it.
Yeah, you do not have the rights to do this. We don't approve of your abilities. And so they decided to punish us by putting us through multiple lifetimes of some sort of discomfort. And one of those lifetimes was being in a toy store as a toy.
Wow.
Okay. Another one was being in a hospital full of deformed and mutant humans, and we were patients there for an entire lifetime. Another one was a post-apocalyptic revolutionary time, which was very violent. And then the final space was entirely white, and it seemed that we had served our time, so to speak. And in this white space, we could literally draw whatever we wanted to come into existence. And so we were creating our own reality through our drawing. And I looked in that space, and I recognized what looked like some of my own sketch pads from my waking life. And I now saw that those sketch pads told this entire multi-lifetime dream story, and that they had prophetically foretold it, and I didn't even realize that I was channeling this multi-lifetime dream.
Okay, so, and who were the ones that had channeled that dream, or who are the prophets of that?
You mean the time police, or the the prophet?
Well, you said that like you realized when you were in that white space that like that there had been this whole sequence had been like preordained
something. In my own sketchbooks that I had done myself.
Okay, right.
Okay? And so I had somehow already created this entire lifetime of realities, and now I was in this blank canvas space where I could create reality.
Right.
And the two protagonists at the end, we had this realization, and we look at each other and say, "This is it." The other person says, questioningly, "This is it?" And then, "Yes, this is it." And then, bam, wake up. And that was the one. And so,
well, just before you offered that last piece about finding it in your own sketchbooks, what I was thinking or noticing was that the time police were tricksters. They were appearing to be forbidding something and holding you back, but that obviously, like the sequence of lifetimes they gave you as a punishment that sounded like a series of bardos, like the toy store thing and the being in a deformed mutant hospital and so forth. It all seems like punishments, like how in the old Soviet Union political dissidents were sent to like horrible psychiatric hospitals as punishments. But the fact that these bardos, because bardos ultimately help people toward enlightenment, at least that's my understanding of how Buddhists see them, or maybe they don't see them that benevolently, I don't know, but they could, in a given case, like in the movie Jacob's Ladder, be these nightmare worlds that then wake you up especially because they're annoying. So if the whole reality is annoying and flat, like being a toy in a toy store, then your realization that you're a round peg put in a way too small square hole is that much more profound, because the square hole is so much smaller than the one that we have where we are right now, because we're here in the waking life right now, but we're having this great talk, and there's no like podcast police making us stop if we're getting too conscious or something, at least not so far. But so they're serving a developmental purpose, and then the developmental purpose exceeds fantastically well, because you wake up to that place where you realize you're the one choosing. It's like with the superimposition of the two matrices on each other. It's like making you aware of you are the one doing it. It's like there's ads for DirecTV that say, not that I want to repeat an ad slogan, but like, don't watch TV, DirecTV. But of course, if you were watching DirecTV, you'd still just be watching TV. But in this case, it's like DirecTV, where you're the director. And so that's what the white space is. And now you're realizing, instead of somebody else holding the remote and changing the channel from one annoying infomercial bardo to another or whatever, now you're realizing, now you've got like that static field on the TV screen, and you realize, like, I can make my own channel now.
Right. Absolutely. It brings to mind another dream. This was one where I went lucid and decided to let go and follow the narrative, and it was another incursion with what I would describe as the trickster dream time police, which has shown up every once in a while, and it's usually a very serious situation that arises.
I think that's fascinating. I mean, I can just believe that like matrices would have an immune system to keep you from violating that structure and being in these unauthorized zones. So it's like you're meeting the threshold guardians. It's fascinating stuff.
It's happened. It's happened a number of times, and this other one was where they were engineering an ecopocalypse of sorts. So they were creating certain explosions that caused floods, and I was riding with the water, and I was able to look at the water so acutely that I realized that it wasn't natural water, but it was more of like a digital substrate that was made of a lot of smaller pieces. And so I followed this water and went underground into what I would describe as something of their underground base. And I saw where their kind of control center was. And I looked at this structure on the ground, which kind of looked like a Geiger-esque biomechanical form that self-organized and built itself up, almost like a staircase up to their control center.
Okay, almost like one of the turns to self-transforming machine elves or something that like is a self-constructing shapeshifting form. But
yeah, I can see that. And so it created this lattice that allowed me to go up to their control center.
Mm-hmm.
And once I got up there, I soon figured out that I was invisible to them, and that I had somehow snuck into their space, and they were talking about some of their frustrations about that, someone's figuring out what's going on, and they're not comfy with it, and their eco-apocalypse isn't going as planned.
Right.
And so I was able to walk into their control center room and read something that was written either on a computer panel or on a piece of paper, and it was extremely crisp.
Extremely what?
Extremely crisp. It was very legible. And without going back to my journal, I can't quote it verbatim.
Right.
But it said something to the tune of a shaman can be an artist in order to help save the world, or a artist can be a shaman in order to help save the world. And it seemed like an interchangeable notion of, artist as shaman to help the world. And then, bam, woke up feeling extremely well rested, and that was, one of those sort of lucid, letting go, narrative, message, dream.
Right. Well,
cycle.
One implication, by the way, of both of those occurrences of the time police is because a question that I had in my mind listening to you talk about them, I was going to ask you, is to what extent did they seem sort of like your dream characters versus autonomous entities that you're experiencing in the dream state, like sometimes happens with mind parasites and things like that, where it seems like there's an actual invading autonomous organism and not simply an autonomous function of my own psyche.
Gotcha.
And I think that both of those dreams gave powerful hints at the end in both cases that it was the latter rather than the former, that it was a representation of internal functions, because there was this benevolent thing at the end that showed that their role was a disguise, because they seem like this invading outside force that's there to shut you down.
Right.
But in each case, you're given a gift, and what they do they turn out to be psychopomps, guiding your soul to a higher level, rather than even threshold guardians that are trying to keep you away from crossing, because they actually pull you into some incredible realization. I mean, one is the ultimate thing with the sketchbooks and the white space, but in the second one too, you're given this incredible message at the end.
Mm-hmm.
So it's sort of like there's a toxic crust to the fortune cookie, but inside is the real gnosis. Because these are very Gnostic dreams, where they're like the archons that are the masters of deception, and now you're being taken behind the curtain to hear their private thoughts. Mm-hmm. But yet, it doesn't turn out that there are real archons. It turns out that it's an internal drama, and the archon is revealed to be a psychopomp or something. So it's like your own dream unfolding rather than
It's very interesting.
Because if they were genuinely autonomous entities who were who they said they were, you wouldn't get the last stage with it. You just keep getting toxic bardos until your spirit was crushed or something, right? Because that's what they would have intended, right? And with the second one, you wouldn't have been able to violate their security, probably. They would know that there was an intruder in their immediate space, and you also wouldn't get this incredible gem of a statement at the end.
Right. That's pretty interesting. This is the sort of thing that makes me want to go back into my journals and review these specifically, kind of with new eyes after some time's passed.
Right.
As that's something that I would like to do more of. I'm great at recording, but unless there's a certain trigger event in my waking life or some other dream that compels me to go back and review, I think it'd be useful to.
Yeah, I mean, what I would be fascinated with would be your analysis of all your time cop dreams to see what they have in common. Like I just pointed out to the two you said, had a structural parallel, that they both had a denouement that completely reversed So what looked like a all black world, now like the black just becomes like the black yin dot and the white yang and the yin yang.
Okay.
Like it's just
Interesting.
It's just there to like get the white going almost, because of where things end up.
Yeah.
So the polarity totally shifts and the meaning changes. But I also wanted to add that I don't assume that there aren't real time pops and things like that. I believe that there are. But the ones you experience in your dream weren't the real ones, or the autonomous ones. They were like ones created by your psyche to act as threshold guardians, to guarding the pearl of great price and all that kind of stuff, and play out this archetypal thing inside of you. But I think in addition to that, there are also real ones out there. Real, I mean, I don't know why I used the word real to disagree, it's so stupid, but that there are autonomous external ones, and who can act like the white blood cells. Like, I think particularly with what I call mind parasites, there are ones who, if you're awakening to it, and like the classic modern mythological version would be Agent Smith in the Matrix, where if you are becoming aware in the Matrix, you violated something, and the parasites, and in the movie they're like AI computers who want to live off our caloric energy or something, use us as batteries, then they will come after you, and I've had experiences like this, to shut you down because you've engaged in forbidden seeing.
Right, but I mean, are the quote unquote real time police or mind parasites invincible?
No.
Or impenetrable? Because
no, not at all.
Okay, because it makes me wonder. It's like, what is our barometer for figuring out whether my experience, whether I was somehow deceiving or conquering or passing through the real ones versus the kind of sub-personalities of myself that was putting on this elaborate show in order for me to have this realization. It's kind of
I mean both are movements in the right direction. In fact, if I had to choose between them, maybe what you experienced is better. Like, why not have a symbolic experience with Nazi prison guards to learn how to deal with like ultimate evil, rather than being in an actual concentration camp? I'll go for the Matrix version that I'm in control of over the more extroverted one any day. And both are moving you toward freedom, right? Because if it's like there's a saying like, personal victories lead to public victories. So like if you work on disciplining yourself, then it leads to some accomplishment out in the real world. But we could kind of like extrapolate that into what you experienced, is that by moving past the time police in your own matrix, it would also strengthen you to be able to do it in the outer world. And it can be seen as a magical medicine to their disease, that it opens that portals to that possibility, because you've like carved that timeline into the morphogenetic field or whatever, and therefore it'll be more possible for other people going through either an inner matrix version of it or an outer.
Right. Yeah, leading by example, showing the possibility.
Yeah, well, like for example, on an ordinary psychological level, there are like the parental introjects, where in addition to having a actual mother who may tell you that like go into a barrage of criticism and say like you're can't do this, or you shouldn't do that, or so forth, you can also have an internal critic like that is your introjection of your actual parent, and that could persist even if they're not around, and so forth.
Absolutely.
So if you're able to deal with the internal one, you'll be in a more empowered place to deal with the interpersonal one. You've dealt with the intrapsychic.
Very true.
Or vice versa. If you stand up to yourself with your actual interpersonal critic or something, then you'll be able to stand up better to the introject version of them too. So these are parallel processes, I guess.
This reminds me of a number of lucid dream cases where someone has experienced some sort of trauma and has a recurring traumatic dream or nightmare that is related to that trauma, and then goes lucid in that space and changes the situation and never has that dream again. And there's some sort of healing that's facilitated that also empowers them to make waking life decisions that they may have been afraid to, given this, kind of psychic block that they've been going on. I heard about one today, actually. This woman had dreams for years about she was being chased by a tiger. And she was always being chased by the tiger. It was going to eat her. But then one day, she decided to turn around in that dream. And she saw that the tiger was now a small kitten that ran away. And the dream disappeared.
Right.
Another case is where someone was molested at a young age, and they had traumatic nightmares of the attacker killing them over and over again for years. And then they went lucid, and they turned the tables, and they actually slayed their attacker, and then that dream disappeared. And that gave them some peace in their waking life afterwards.
Right. Well, I think a strong case could be made for this being a mainline continuation or pushing the envelope state of core evolutionary through line with everything, even starting with one-celled life. Because I talk about this in some podcast or a document on my site called Pushing the Envelope, Boundary Expansion into Novelty in Personal and Evolutionary Context, or something like that. And so one way to think about it is that this is all about the growth of interiority. And the very beginning of life, they say, was when lipids were formed, because you needed like a complex organic molecule that could enclose something. Because if you don't enclose something and have interiority, then like the contents of metabolism diffuse out into the environment. So the whole evolution of life, like then the next big phase, another big phase was cephalization, when there starts to be like a head or an asymmetric deposition of nerve tissue. And now there's an inner simulacrum is starting to be formed. From sense organs, information is coming in, and now in some neural net or some brain, the outside matrix is being reconstructed. Like even in a bee, it sees a world through its compound eyes and so forth, and that's like happening inside.
Right.
And it's always time buffered, because by the time the brain or whatever has done all that, a fraction of a second has gone by. So we all, like organisms that have sense organs and stuff, are like living in a simulacrum matrix that's a neurological reconstruction of a past event. Sounds, tactile sensations, visual, that has to get passed through things and then get reprocessed a fraction of a second later. So this is all a growth of interiority. It's like now there are these interior simulacrums, but now we're at the phase where we can have like a voiceover going on. We can make other stuff happen in that space. We don't have to just be seeing, what's rushing at me because I'm a hardwired scorpion, and that's like all I can process. I can have a fantasy going on, so now there's like those two things at once. I'm fantasizing about a romantic relationship, but I'm also like waiting online at the coffee shop or whatever.
So how does this tie into the recurring?
So here's how. Now we have a still further progression of interiority, where within that inner space, a whole matrix. The whole matrix is being made archetypal and recapitulated within, and where the psyche within can reform it. And instead of becoming, it was a growth in life and self-awareness that a being could replicate what was going on outside, but just passively. The scorpion isn't trying to reimagine what's out there. It's just trying to see threats or see prey or things like that. But when you've reached the point where you can internalize the movie and then alter it, that's like a whole nother octave of development. In that whole same through line of interiority, the growth of interiority. Because now there's a movie maker within that interior space, and so forth. And that's why things like, and so all of these things have some element of that. That's why fantasy writing is a real pushing the envelope experience, because you're sub-creating. When you're a lucid dreamer, you're awakening to sub-creator is a term J.R. Tolkien came up with to describe fantasy writing on a certain level.
Which term again?
Sub-creation.
Okay.
And I think he was influenced by his Orthodox Catholicism,
right,
because he didn't want to say he was like the creator, but like we were like sub-creators. Even he recognized it was like a godlike state. And so that's what we are waking up into, is a more profoundly interior state. And I don't know if you've heard my rap on this before, but apparently up to like the time of Homer, people weren't having private emotions. They were. That's why in the Odyssey, Homer marvels that Odysseus is able to like be one way while he's feeling a totally different way inside. Like we just take that for granted, that people are duplicitous and they're two-faced and that kind of thing. But that was seen as a superhero-like thing. Just like a dog doesn't have private emotions, it will perform whatever it's feeling with its body. It doesn't like wag its tail and pretend to be happy when it's really like angry, but it's like putting on the front. So it's a growth of interiority that like that it's common to like create a fake persona that's different than what you're actually feeling. And lots of people can do that. Maybe not children, but lots of people do it. And like St. Augustine had a friend who people marveled at because he read silently. People only read aloud, and they're like, it's like he's reading out loud in his head. So there's been this huge growth of interiority, and one of the huge evolutionary milestones of it was the novel, and like even the word novelty. The fact that like an animal can have this incredibly complex, self-generated inner experience, and where other characters, because we can support more than one personality, come alive and seem to become autonomous, and all these events happen. And then we create this like telepathic artifact where somebody else can like download this whole complex interior experience we created and preserved in words. I mean, this is a fantastic thing. You don't see hunter-gatherers aren't writing novels or fantasy series. This is an amazing, development.
Well, I mean, would you say that novels are one form of dream delivery tech?
Certainly they can be, absolutely.
Okay. Through I guess
even if they're mundane,
right.
Dreams can be mundane.
True. And you briefly mentioned earlier, being a movie maker of an interior space, and I know, earlier today during your talk you talked about movies also as dream delivery technologies, and then at the very end I mentioned how video games are also like.
I wish I'd recorded that.
I'm trying my best to recapitulate. I have an experience of in earlier part of my life playing a lot of video games, and it's not something that I really engage with now. Although with my performances, it's projection performance. I'm using a controller, and a lot of my hand-eye coordination from playing video games taps in directly into controlling live animation improvisationally. So it's like I'm creating the video game.
Right, that's amazing, right?
But
there's that classic progression again, from being a passive consumer of video games to probably playing more complex interactive ones to then spontaneously generating your own. I mean, you see how all these things you're doing in your life like parallel perfectly. Interesting. There you are in the white space now with your sketchbooks.
Oh, that's true.
So that's great when you have thematic unity in your life and you're doing artistically what's happening on the dream level and all the different levels.
Yeah, interesting. That makes sense, huh? I hadn't thought about the performance itself as its own dream delivery technology too, and
and it's kind of like mutual dreaming, because you could pick up on the mood of the crowd too and be influenced by that.
Well, here's the thing. Absolutely, my performance group Art Theism features my dance partner Samantha Beasley. She's on stage, and she's well trained in modern, academic, and classical forms of dance, while I am controlling the visualizations and in real time through a touch screen. and we're able to have this light-based communication and react to one another and literally
logos
dance
communication.
There you go. There you go. And it's literally projected upon her body and her surroundings. And so she can see it on herself and she can react to that. She can turn and she can see her shadow and react to that, and vice versa. You know, we start to lose the sensation
dreaming
of who is.
technologically.
Okay. Interesting. Yeah, mutual technological dreaming. There's times where we lose track of who is guiding who.
Right.
And it becomes this unit that moves together. And then a step further, you mentioned the audience, picking up their energy. She's extremely adept at visibly looking at an audience, looking them in the eyes, seeing where they're at, and energetically transmuting what's going on there. And so that affects her movement, because our performances are not choreographed. Sometimes we have moments of structure that we've agreed upon beforehand, but there is a lot of room for freedom and improvisation.
Like a jazz improvisation.
Yeah, structured improvisation.
Right.
And a lot of that content can come from what she's picking up from the audience.
Right.
And so, you know, she's not just being super modern, serious dance face or very happy. You know, sometimes she will go to some very difficult spaces emotionally. Sometimes she will cry on stage and take, you know, people on a journey. And, you know, my lights are a way of kind of pinpointing and highlighting those moments. You know, sometimes the lights are extremely small and just on her face, or a tiny dot, or sometimes they're extremely large and fast moving. You know, she goes between being very fast and sometimes extremely quiet and, you know, sitting in a meditative position. And so there's a very wide spectrum of expression that's possible. And so what comes to mind is, you know, using this as a way, an inviting way for people to, you know, explore themselves and kind of go on this almost like techno-shamanic prayer formance of sorts, because it's approached very much with intention. And, you know, we have some pieces that are kind of very happy, and then we have works that we're going to dive in deep and, you know, take someone on a journey. And what's interesting is there's been a few cases where people report afterwards, you know, what's going on. Sometimes there's a lot of deep emotions that come up, and many people will report tears, and we've had 2 occasions of people reporting out-of-body experiences during our performances, and they were totally sober.
Well, I mean, I think you're creating a lucid dream, and what's fascinating is that it even works well with that idea I talked about yesterday of the distributed processing power theory I have of dreams, that the dreamer doesn't have to create the dream, that there's an implicit intelligence or something in the universe that co-creates it. And this is what's actually happening. So in the way you described it, at least, I don't know if this is always the case, but in your description of it, she was leading the process. And if you think of her as like the soul, because she's female and more body-centered, and she's like expressing this emotion or having tears, and then you're projecting images onto her, which makes me think of like what Terrence said about cephalopods, that they wear their language on their skin.
Oh, yes.
You know, this is here's like the visual communication, or like Ray Bradbury's Illustrated Man or something, where you're putting the story, you're turning it into a story, and or a visually revealed thing, and now she's wearing it, so it's like now you're the processing power that creates the dream. The soul enters the dream space with a certain emotion, and now you, as the dream technology, create the surrounding story that would go with that emotion to help illustrate it. So you're like the processing power. And in the instances you described, you were, she was always taking the lead. Is that always the case, or
not? No, not necessarily.
Okay.
No.
Because sometimes the images take the lead, and then she changes her choreography to go with that.
And then there's also times where my light disappears, and if we're working in a situation where there is very little or no ambient light, we create, a sort of sensory deprivation. And so, so my light disappears, she disappears, and then I'm able to help her reappear in a different spot on the stage, so she can teleport from one space to another based on what I choose to do. And so in that way, I'm directing attention of, where is this light being projected. To jump back for a moment, two things come to mind. One, in that multiple subsequent life time cop dream from earlier, I'm pretty sure she was the female protagonist in the dream, that we both stopped time together. So, and
it's perfect because you're both like lucid dream artists that are creating these waking dreams. So she'd be the perfect person to play a parallel role to yours, as someone awakening to the white space in the matrix creation space.
Yep, that makes sense. And then secondly, in regards to using video game controllers, again, a big part of my youth growing up.
Right.
And as I started doing more dream work, I noticed that, there's a dream style or dream pattern I have sometimes where the dream is being controlled through my use of a video game controller.
Oh, wow.
And that has been extremely useful sometimes in either lucid awareness to have that lucid achievement, or to use a game controller while lucidly aware. And it's a very interesting interface to control the parameters of a dream with this game interface, whether it's buttons, knobs, or scrollers.
Yeah, this is why I've told people not to have such negative judgments about video games, because even though the sword cuts both ways, and there are all kinds of people losing their youth to this arousal addiction, there are also going to be mutants like yourself who this is like their first experience of the superimposed matrix thing, because they're in their mom's basement or they're in their room, and that's one reality, but at the same time the first person shooter or whatever is going on, and so you are benefiting from being aware of like the multiple parallel matrix thing, and that you can be in control of it or shift certain things, or that you're not just a passive consumer of it, but an active participant in it.
It's like an interactive videoplastic environment.
Right.
Training tool.
Right. And for the empowered person can then bring that same technology, and that sort of becomes almost a literal thing in your dreams, where you become aware of the controller, because that's how you've navigated. You're used to like a joystick or whatever to move around and stuff, and so that's a great volitional interface or something, because you've already had your ability to be a set creator enhanced by video games, much more compared to like, when I was growing up and there were like 3 big networks, and like, you had like 5, even in New York City, you had like 5 channels on the TV, and it was completely passive. You didn't affect it whatsoever. It was one way. I've never been able to myself deal with playing video games in any way, and of course I'm from an older generation, so I wasn't born into it either. What year were you born?
1983.
Okay, so you're really you're actually sort of like on the opening cusp of the millennial generation, I guess. Really, you're kind of like right between like the trailing edge of Gen X and of the millennials. And growing up into a totally computerized world.
Yeah, I remember
video games already there.
The video games were already there. They were very basic. I was playing 8-bit games early on, and saw the transition from 2-dimensional to 3-dimensional graphics technologies. The transition of the kind of music and sounds possible to actual voice recording, and seeing the difference there, and also noticing the internet has been a big part of my life, but I remember when there was no public internet too. And so it's been interesting to see a lot of these things really kind of birth as I've grown up.
Well, it's another parallel stream that's very much like becoming a more empowered lucid dreamer. So if you think about you as the gamer, as like a dreamer, and then the games are the dreams, the matrices are improving. And also, like, the game controller's powers are improving because you start out with, like, Space Invaders and you can go in, like, XY coordinates or something totally primitive, or Pong or whatever for the ultimate, like, shrunken universe or truncated universe, to now where you can, World of Warcraft, design your own avatar, and, like, you're much more empowered. And the Matrix has improved. It's become more HD. It's become more fully realized and more idioplastic.
Well, This begs the question, because I'm not so much of a gamer anymore, as far as console or game work outside of the performance aspect. But with modern gaming, there are other types of even more interactive controllers, such as the Wiimote.
Okay.
For the Nintendo Wii. And that's something that is able to, detect where you are pointing. It has an accelerometer inside of it and so forth. And so you're using, your body in a different way. You're not just pressing buttons.
It seems like it's more right hemisphere, because it's not just like 0-1 press or don't press, but like you can like be more. You're moving in this complex way naturally. You're not thinking about I'm going left or right, or I'm going forward or back.
Kinesthetic awareness is now a deeper part of the game controller experience.
Wow.
And then keep in mind now the infrared cameras, such as the Kinect peripheral for the Xbox.
Okay.
Which scans an area in front of it, and so you can use your entire body to be in front of this camera, and it's not true 3D.
Right. but it's getting there.
It's getting there. It doesn't see what's on the backside.
Right. Right.
Although some people are putting two cameras and creating a more full image. But that way you're using motion.
Right.
So.
By the way, instead of fighting the distraction, just to point out that like our background has also been like a dream, in the sense that it's been by distributed processing power. It's going on outside of us, seemingly outside of our control. Because people here are probably not noticing us that much, but maybe the fact that there's still two people in the cafe is making them a little bit more animated or more willing to keep the place going. But the dream went through a huge phase change, because when we first started talking, everything was coming down, lights were being turned off, it looked like it was about to shut off. You're expecting that moment, like, it's time, gentlemen, like in the British bars, and they have to close at 2 a.m. And I just saw that coming, and then it's sort of like now, like the public part of it had shut down, and now suddenly, like, all these characters are coming out and having their own experience of the coffee shop workers, their own like dream, and it's becoming more animated and more alive. After it went through this like death of its public thing and so forth.
It's been reborn in a certain way.
Right. So that's kind of like a dream that's surrounding us, a superimposed reality, because it's kind of seems to be pursuing its own autonomous timeline. Like we're going to assume that like something very similar would have happened if we were not here. Though our presence may have some effect, on it as well.
Good observation. Back to the game controllers, it makes me wonder. Again, I don't play the modern gaming equipment, but I wonder how some of those types of more movement and kinesthetic awareness-based control systems for gaming may affect someone's relationship to dreaming. For example, I have the handheld controller. Part of my personal history. But what about someone who's younger than I, who has the kinesthetic awareness controller, and how may that become part of their own dream history?
Yeah, and it's more advanced because if you don't need a plastic gadget to navigate, but navigate with your body, just like we see, and we have I guess it's already off-the-shelf technology, when we are expanding things on our touch screen by pulling our fingers apart, where we're starting to relate to computers more kinesthetically, and in like sci-fi movies and stuff, you'll see somebody is like in front of a holographic screen and they're using gestures to change things and moving things away. But we pretty much already have that, it's just not well distributed or something. So that's a more advanced level. And then, of course, telepathic manipulation would be still further along in that process. So each of these does seem like a real evolutionary step. And what's happening is that the alternate matrix is becoming more and more encompassing, like with the using your whole body to move in any direction. It's more bihemispheric. There's going to be more right hemisphere, and there are going to be different breakthroughs that are going to really allow people to enter these alternate matrices more powerfully. And here's one of the ones that I think must be close by, even though I'm not a technologist. Okay. It's when it's just like on the movie set for the movie Avatar, James Cameron could look through like $1 million camera and see the actors who were there in their like black leotards with blue squares or whatever for their motion capture.
Right.
And when he looked through the camera, he would see them as their like Navi avatars in real time as they're moving. Now, when your laptop can do that,
augmented reality, right there.
Right. So now, when you have enough distributing processing power that I can enter World of Warcraft and I have this avatar, but its movements aren't stereotyped by the software. But now the lens, the camera, that infrared zone or whatever your camera, for example, is capturing my movements and mapping them onto the avatar in real time. And if that's good enough, because like when they create these like CGI movies where it's motion capture from real actors, I realized this after seeing the CGI movie Beowulf, where there's like Anthony Hopkins plays a character, but you're seeing the digital avatar version.
Right.
But they've captured like on the set of Avatar, they have this little boom light under their face to brighten their facial highlights, and it also has a little camera to capture their changes of their facial expressions that they can map onto the avatar. So now if you can play World of Warcraft and have your facial expressions mapped onto the avatar, we can do it already, but it's not off the shelf consumer level. Now you enter that computer game matrix where you're playing with people from Korea or whatever, the multiplayer situation, but now it's like a real social interaction. It's like meeting somebody at a festival, because you see things that they don't even mean to reveal, because that's how facial communication works. So it starts to have the richness and depth and ambiguity of a real social encounter.
Right.
So when that gets going, that's going to be a whole, that difference between matrices is really going to blur.
I've heard a few people talking about this particular notion in relation to where VR, virtual reality, is going, and now much more technically feasible with devices like the Oculus Rift. I don't know if you've
I've been hearing about it.
Tried one before.
I thought they weren't out yet.
Well, to be honest, I don't know. But what I can say is that
I sense it's going to be big. I sense it's going to, because I've been waiting for that consumer, that when you can get the Samsung $400 gadget that really puts you in VR. That is a game changer, evolutionarily, in every way.
Well, thanks to some of the podcasts I've been listening to, I think it is available, given what some of the folks on there, enthusiasts who have tried it and who have them. Okay. It makes me think that they are available. But with that being said, a couple years ago, I was helping to art direct in the earlier stages of a video game. A game called Sound Self. One word, Sound Self, and directed by Robin Arnott. He's a sound engineer.
Okay.
And it was actually inspired by a Burning Man installation that he experienced a few years ago.
A Burning Man situation?
Burning Man installation.
Installation, okay.
And so, basically, this game works really well with the Oculus Rift as an immersive experience. But the idea is basically you sing, speak, or chant like that into a microphone. And when you do this, it takes in your sound and then reproduces it. Reproduces an instrumental version of whatever pitch, so it has pitch detection. So now in the speakers of the headphones, you hear whatever pitch you were singing coming back at you. While simultaneously there are these, there's generative geometry that it kind of looks like mandalas, but a little bit different, with radial symmetry that is tied to these oscillators of whatever your voice is doing. And so the graphics are also reacting to your voice.
So it's almost like the role that you play in your art pieces, where you start projecting onto her based on her emotions and things like that. But in the case where the person takes the lead, you know, like in the cases you described where she took the lead and then you project appropriate images onto her, it's like this device is doing something like that, from what you're saying.
In a way, it's like it's a feedback loop.
Right.
And I think people get the most out of it when they choose to, you know, chant a single note or ohm for a long period of time, because that actually unlocks certain algorithms that deepen the visual and audio story that takes place. So it's kind of a structured improvisation, and you can only go so deep if you continue chanting the same note. And that's part of like what the game. That's what you unlock in the game. You can't really beat the game, but that's what you can go deeper into the experience by chanting the same note. And so, and when wearing an Oculus Rift, this becomes an entirely immersive environment where it's pitch black, but then there's this light that is created by your voice, and then the sound as well. And I mean, it's kind of like going through a tunnel, like a tunnel of light. Some of the graphics are actually absolutely like that.
I mean, I want it. But when I've looked it up online, I think it says it's like being released in like 2015, but maybe there are like beta versions out that people are getting to experiment with or something. Or?
With the Oculus?
Oculus, yeah. I thought it was like not yet released publicly.
I really don't know. This particular game is still under production. There are beta versions of this game that you can download and play online at SoundSelf. I believe SoundSelfthegame.com.
Right.
But you don't need an Oculus to play it. You can play it on your computer still. And it's for home computers. And the other thing is that we've also done it in installation situations, like in a small geodesic dome with a hanging microphone in the middle. People can all kind of lay in the center, chant together, and then project the visuals up on the ceiling. Okay.
All right. Well, think about this, like especially once you get something like Oculus Rift going, because then you can put any content in there. And here is a depth psychology feedback system that acts like a mirror, like you're talking about, and would be incredibly dreamlike, and yet involves hardware that's like from the 1980s, basically. But also using everything you have, like Oculus Rift, as your baseline to build up on. But you create a program where, sometimes marketing research places will pull you into something in a mall, like they've got a storefront set up, and they'll ask you to, I've done this like once, where they pull you into a trailer, and like they had me like watch an ad for Kodak film or something.
Right.
That's how old it was. And the whole point of the ad, they had laser tracking on your eyes. They want to see what you're looking at. And the whole thing is they want to have a distracting enough scene so that you're not reading the letters at the bottom of the screen that says this is a simulation. Simulated image or something, because like they have a bouncing beach ball going past you or whatever, and you're following that, or however they are misdirecting you. And I had a film camera that had that infrared that knew where my cornea was pointed to see what I was focusing on, and could focus automatically on that. Canon AE1 or something. I mean, that's 1990s technology. So now if you have that off-the-shelf hardware that sees what you're focusing on the screen, and now you have sufficiently intelligent software. So, for example, let's say it's a World of Warcraft like setup, but now the adolescent kid who's playing it, the program notices that like whenever we bring in a female dominatrix or a female warrior character with like big breasts or something, he really stares His attention goes right to it. So that's his thing. Now we know his type. So now we're going to shift the story so that his key ally is a like dominatrix, like Amazonian woman. So it's starting to become like I mean, that's a cheesy example, but it's starting to become like the distributing processing power of a dream, where it would be completely possible to observe what archetypes obsess you. Okay, is it of an androgynous figure? Is it of, what is it? We can start to figure out what archetypes dominate you, and now change the storyline to accommodate that. I mean, and obviously, if we had like AI, that could be done infinitely more sophisticated way, as is done in the Ender books. There's and they have a battle school, and they have a psychologically evaluating computer game. But the art AI like learns about that individual student, and like Ender's like afraid of his brother. It'll like bring his brother into it to see how he reacts.
Oh,
it like really will fuck with his psyche.
Wow, interesting. Yeah, I'd like to read those. I hear good things.
They are very good.
I think we may have mentioned it yesterday, but I think it's worth bringing up, and that is the combination of dream work in association with sensory deprivation, isolation, flotation tanks.
Right.
Because that's something that I've just started working with myself, and I see a lot of potent, possibilities there.
Right.
Of using that as a space to induce a certain type of lucidity.
Right.
Perhaps.
How about it as a space to put on your waterproofed Oculus Rift and go into virtual reality when you're in the state of like most disassociation from gravity while still in your body.
Whoa. Huh.
And I mean, it would just have to be like the visual part, because auditory would be best to come through the underwater speakers, like in the Flotation tank thing I went to in the 80s. I mean, they had that.
Right.
Because water's such a good conductor, and you get great three-dimensional sound, and then you just have the glasses on to show you the images. It'd be a pretty intense way to play your game.
Yeah. Well, this brings to mind something else, because that is quite a change in sensation and perception. Not only do you have this sensory deprivation, you have this flotation feeling, but then you have this other world, through your visual system. And what is the transition out of that like for the individual? And I mention that because in my first 2 float sessions, I have the choice to turn off the light inside the pod.
Right.
And during the last 5 minutes, the light turns back on. Because some people fall asleep, and the music and the light kind of comes back on to gently awake you.
Right.
And so every time I've only done this twice so far, but each time the light comes back on, I have not fallen asleep. I keep my eyes open so far.
Okay.
And whenever the light goes on, so very abruptly, it's a very, very subtle light. I mean, it's very light compared to any of these lights around here, but nonetheless, it's very different from total darkness.
Right.
And so the light goes on, and I just start laughing hysterically because I do not realize how sort of far out I've been.
Right.
And so dissociated and deprived of sight. And as soon as it comes back, my reaction is I think it's absolutely hilarious, because I forgot that I've had a body.
Right.
And here I am now.
It's such a lucid dreaming experience, again.
Yeah.
And just like you described, that like falling asleep wakefulness, if you could be there to be through that whole liminal twilight zone, like you start out and you're stepping into the pod and you're very aware of your body proprioceptively and all that kind of thing, but then through some layered process, you're starting to, when you have no gravity to deal with anymore, you're starting to go out into a dream body of some sort. And that's a very interesting process because you're creating a waking dream on demand, basically.
Waking dream on
demand, right?
Yeah. Interesting. I'm also interested in combining different modalities with the tank experiences, such as choosing to do yoga beforehand or afterwards, or exert myself physically beforehand, and how does that affect my experience? If I bicycle to the space versus driving
or
to the space.
THC dose. Assuming you do it sparingly, and so therefore it actually acts as a mild hallucinogen. I mean, I've tried the flotation tank with different substances, and of course, altered states and all that kind of thing. But those are obvious variations of the experiment.
True. I know Rogan's talked about it on his cast. He has a tank at home, and so
oh wow, okay.
So he's able to experiment with that on a regular basis. And I'm also interested in, there's different size tanks.
Right.
And so I've only had one so far. It's more of like a womb-like pod-shaped tank, but there's also rooms and larger spaces.
Right, exactly. Those sarcophagus-like things. I mean, it's almost like the sarcophagus-like thing that Jake, the paraplegic Marine in Avatar, gets into. And then he's going to be shifted into his avatar from that coffin-like enclosure, right, where his physical body is. And so the pods are almost look like a version of that. But I prefer the rooms.
Okay.
And the facility I went to actually had health insurance paid for back in the late 80s, early 90s. It was like a little small swimming pool.
Right.
So it felt very spacious. It wasn't like I was in this confined space with a lid above your head and that kind of thing. And also they had the stereo underwater speakers for the binaural beats and hemisync kind of stuff playing.
Interesting.
So that was a pretty good combination.
Interesting.
I mean, I could think of all kinds of variations if you had a big enough budget. Like, for example, what if instead of the Oculus Rift, you're floating in what's shaped like a domed space, like a planetarium almost, and that dome, because now in planetariums they don't project an image on a screen anymore. I've noticed they've just upgraded them all. Like, instead of a screen, every surface is a pixelated screen.
Right.
It's just much more logical. Now you have a computer do it, and basically it's a dome-shaped video monitor you're in.
Right.
So if you're floating in the tank and above you is this dome-shaped thing that can produce anything, and the default is just a star field, but that's so good it looks just like you're floating under the stars. But you could, have done a little pre-structure to that at some point it's going to bring you into Monument Valley, or it's going to bring you into a desert or whatever, or you could control that somehow with your own words or something, and that would be pretty powerful.
And it's interesting because it's almost like this omnidirectional vision, which reminds me a little bit about some of the NDE vision experiences, being able to see sort of omnidirectionally in a sense.
Right, and you could also change the orientation, so you could start out where it's like you're looking up at the screen, but why not make the center of the screen like your eye-level view? So instead of like the desert, being like something that you're looking at from above or something, or from above the whole plane of it, what if it's an eye-level view at the center of the dome? So it's filling your field of view, because now your bodily orientation is different, where it's not so clear that there's up or down. It's like being in the weightlessness of space somewhat. So changing the whole orientation seems like it would be possible, right?
Very true. So I'd like to make an observation, probably due to my own body's alertness and sleep schedule. Begin to have these sort of hypnagogic visions of the sides of the insides of your black jacket right there. Briefly were looking like you had pigtails, and so I'm realizing that I'm getting tired and it's starting to get a little light outside. So is there any any particular questions that you wanted to cover while we're still here? For me,
right? Yeah, I don't want to keep you up and destroy your sleep schedule. We've got some great stuff down there, but it's fascinating that, like, even if that's the end point, it's an amazing end point, because it's like we're pulling back the frame to what's actually going on in our interaction, rather than the content of what we're talking about related to, like, dream experiences and hypothetical VR experiences. Now we're talking about the actual conversation, and in the actual conversation you're having that layered experience where now the REM is like bleeding through and the environment is surrealizing and so forth. So if you want to end there, that's the perfect endpoint, because
it's funny. Liminal spaces are on their way.
Right. You're in a liminal space.
I guess for the record, I'd like to just like kind of make a statement about a summary of what my experience is. In that I started dream journaling 10 years ago, and it was during a time of great transition for me. I had to make a lot of different life choices at the time, and dream journaling was one of the things that really...
You would have been like 21.
I was 21, exactly. Yep. And, it was the year I started dream journaling. It was the year I, went to hospital for an injury. It was the year that I started teaching myself yoga and reading more about esotericism of all forms. And it's also when I started finding my own drawing style instead of imitating others. It's when I started becoming more involved in community organizing art events. And it was the year that my name changed from Chris to Topher. And as I started journaling, started recalling more and more exponentially, until I started reaching this upper limit of recalling about 7 dreams a night. And then lucid dreams started happening more frequently, and other kind of strange dream phenomena such as the bilocation and sort of awake to sleep, immediate lucidity situations. But for me personally, it's been a powerful tool for not only understanding my subconscious, but for really transformation and healing from various life events, overcoming addiction, whether to substance or to compulsive waking behavior. It's acted as a biofeedback system for me to better understand what serves me best and what doesn't. And dream life has helped me understand that significantly. It's also assisted with creative inspiration, with decision making, with kind of developing my own dream mythology of what are my personal archetypes, because as I've kept journaling over the years, I've noticed well, this certain subject arises when such and such is happening in my waking life, and so I can see what kind of triggers there are. To a certain degree, there's been a little bit of prophetic dreams here and there. It's not something that happens very often, but it's definitely played a role here and there.
Clairvoyant dreams?
Yep. And then the lucidity transition from going to taking control to letting go, and then more recently working with asking questions or making declarative statements in that space. And in the past couple of years is when I started to facilitate lucid dream empowerment workshops. And in doing so, I've recently started adding in activities that engage the body, and also to socialize with other people during the space where we have some group exercises that drive home some of the points that I'm making. And so I'll be sharing some of that tomorrow at 3:33 at the Jedi Lotus Temple here at the Arise Festival, Sunrise Ranch, Colorado.
Yeah, I've got to make sure I can find that tomorrow. Got to figure out where that is exactly. I know you drew it on my map. I know you drew it on my map, but I'll figure it out. But
it's white. I'll tell you that giant.
It's another thing with like white cutout-looking pieces of plywood that like look like white, as if they were cut out of paper or something, or it's like this geometric shape that's right near the art gallery. It's not that, right?
No, it's on the other side of the main gate.
Okay.
So it's actually a theme camp installation.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. And then it'll be off to the right when you cross that, like a boundary between like the parking lot area, the camping area, and the festival. It's well, I did mark it on the map.
So when you say the main gate, do you mean that wooden barrier
that wooden barrier
that crosses the two sides?
So you cross
security check.
If you were coming from here and you go through that main gate,
right?
It would be a couple camps to your left.
Look to my left.
Yeah.
Okay.
And again, it's the only one that gets a big white installation. It has multiple pods that are they all have sort of altars inside of them.
Oh wow!
And they're fabric spheres, basically, with vulva-like entrances.
Okay. I better be able to find that, or something's very wrong, or that doesn't stand up.
And then up top is a 70-foot dream catcher.
It's a pretty good landmark.
Yeah. And one last thing. This is not like offhanded observation. When I visited the space and I looked up at this giant dream catcher,
right,
I isolated the sun through the clouds so I could see the sun without hurting my eyes because it was through a thick layer of clouds in the center of the dream catcher, and I noticed a visual phenomenon of concentric circles and rays of light that were aligned with the dream catcher. And I'm wondering, are these just rays from the sun? So then I shifted my perspective and moved the sun away from the center of the dream catcher.
Right.
And I realized that this visual phenomenon was still there, but it's not aligned with the sun. It was aligned with the dream catcher.
Wow.
And it looked like this very subtle, again, concentric circle slash radial starburst field that was aligned with the sort of the center mandala of the Dreamcatcher, and it was extremely peculiar. And
was the Dreamcatcher a very fine grid or not? Like
it's pretty fine.
Pretty fine.
It's not super thick. It's a pretty fine grid. The closest thing I've experienced is looking at spider webs in an altered state.
Okay.
I could see a similar signature to that. And so I found it very interesting. Again, I was viewing it and I was totally sober too. So very
yeah, I'll definitely hope for that kind of shift in perception when I look through it. But just one closing thing is that for me, first of all, the time of day is syncing up perfectly because now this is a liminal zone because we're just getting the first light coming in, like waking up in the floating sarcophagus type of thing. The subtle light gently bring us into the daylight world. But I also want to say that all these we can really see, or where there's real corroboration of what you're doing, is such an evolutionary through line. Is, well, first of all, for you, obviously it is, and like you go through these stages almost like the hero's journey of like you're stressed out when you're 21, you have like a medical shock, and you start to, it's like the call to adventure, and then you end up being able to bring the gift back to the collective and teach it in the last phase, the most recent phase of the journey. But also where you see it as like having a core evolutionary theme is that it produced massive collateral benefits. So like you described all these different areas where you got healthier and where all kinds of different dark neurotic things dropped away and creativity was enhanced. So when you have like a massive collateral benefit, that's totally a core shifting evolutionary thing that can have that kind of power, like the near-death experience can. So that's fantastic.
Thank you for observing that. And
this is your encounter with the singularity archetype.
Yeah.
With all these different episodes and phases. I mean, it's all part of like discovering yourself as the magician and aware of yourself as able to co-create matrices.
Fascinating. Well, I appreciate the opportunity to share this with you, and appreciate your time and attention, and I appreciate your helpful interpretation of some of the dreams that I've shared with you.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much. So I guess that was a mutant mind meld or something, and that's Jonathan Zapp signing off. And you want to do your sign off too?
No, thank you. This is Topher Sipes, and
do you have a website? I
certainly do. Actually, I have two websites. My main website is tophersipes.com. That's TOPHERSIPES.com. That'll have my graphic design, illustration, fine artwork. Store should be up soon, along with some of the visuals that I project over musicians, and an upcoming schedule of any lucid dream workshops I'm giving, any art galleries or shows, or any performance animation gigs that I've got. And then the other site is arttheism.net, and that's ARTHEISM.net, and that's my performance group I mentioned earlier with Samantha Beasley, where we combine Logos Beheld light communication projected over modern Buto-like prayer form and stance. So those are the two places that you can follow what I'm up to these days.
Okay, and my website, Zapp Oracle, spelled the way it sounds, ZAPOracle.com. And this is the Arise Festival, August 10th, I guess it is now, 2014. Signing off.